Hello, everyone at UU, and thank you for making this video appearance possible. I'd much rather be there, but I had a trip come up that I needed to take, so Sarah was gracious enough to help me prepare this for you, but I do send you my greeting. I'll start with a reading. This comes from a column from the San Francisco Chronicle written by Joan Ryan, who was always one of my favorite columnists when I lived in San Francisco. She begins, I wasn't sure why the image of Sofia Pedro kept appearing in my head. I'd see her while I was driving, brushing my teeth, walking to the corner store, even though I only knew her through a story I had read in the newspaper. Sophie is a young woman who lived on a corn and bean farm in Mozambique with her two young children. Her husband spent most of his time in the capital, where he sold cigarettes and candy, so he wasn't home when the Limpopo River burst its banks. Sophia was 9 months pregnant. She climbed a tree to escape the rushing water, tying the children to branches to keep them safe. As the water swirled past them with rotting animal carcasses and furniture and roofs, Sophia's ailing aunt fell in, too sick and despairing to hold on. On the third day in the tree without food or drinkable water, Sophia felt her first labor pains. By this time, the muddy water was just 6 feet below her and still rising. Then Rosita, her mother-in-law, positioned herself on a slightly lower branch and used her legs to brace Sophia's legs as the young woman gave birth. Later, a South African medic descended from a rescue helicopter and lifted the mother and baby to safety. I'd be reading a story about how germs on my kitchen sponge can make me sick, and Sofia Pedro would pop into my head. I'd be listening to a report on how the benzene emitted from car exhausts might cause cancer, or how we're at danger for diabetes if we don't lose some weight, and there she'd be again. I'd be talking to a friend about orthopedic surgeons and dermatologists and therapists because our bodies and psyches are buckling under the stress of work and age and life. And suddenly I'd see Sophia in that tree with the water raging below and the fire ants crawling over her body and her feet pushed up against her mother-in-law's legs. And then one day it struck me. In a culture that's always telling us how weak we are, how vulnerable to sickness and death, how susceptible to all manner of physical and psychological damage, the image of Sofia Pedro was like a curtain being pulled back. And what I saw was myself. The self underneath the bad back and the creaky knees and the hardening arteries. Thinking of Sophia made me feel stronger, as if I, as a member of the same species, also have in me that kind of will and resistance and resilience. I felt connected to the young Mozambique woman in the distant but palpable way I feel that I am connected to Olympic athletes who leap further or run faster than anyone else ever has. I can barely jog around the neighborhood, much less run or leap. Yet when I watch great athletes, I draw from them an odd sense of pride. They're the neon sign reminders that we, each of us, carry within us a piece of the athlete's grace and strength and courage. Sofia Pedro did what she had to do under the circumstances. Maybe that doesn't make her a hero, but giving birth in the midst of so much death, clinging to a branch of crawling, stinging ants, qualifies in my book as heroic. No doubt I'll still find myself worrying about dust mites and colon cancer and odd lumps on the skin. I'll sometimes feel as if I'm drowning from too many obligations and not enough time. But when I do, I hope I will think of Sophia Pedro and stop fearing what I can't do and remember what I can. We live in difficult times. We're discouraged by the ongoing destruction of our planet's vitality. We're weary of the restrictions placed on us by this pandemic. And we are grieved by the illness and death that accompanies it. People have been subject to all manner of difficult times in all places and in over the eons of time that people have existed. The survivors often report that they feel that what saved them was a curious alchemy of will and grace. And I think these extreme stories have something to teach us. I'll tell you another story, another true story. In the spring of 2003, Aaron Ralston was a 27-year-old mechanical engineer who set out for a day hike through a remote canyon in Utah. Trying to slip between two rock walls, a large boulder shifted, pinning his hand underneath. He was trapped. Sensing the futility of panic, he says in his book, "It took some big thinking to calm myself down." He coolly made a mental list of all of his options. He waited, but he hadn't told anyone where he was going, and he didn't have a cell phone. He tried to chip away at the rock with his very small knife. He tried to lift the boulder using his climbing rope to rig a pulley, but the 800-pound stone would not budge. By the third day, he was out of food and water. He went through periods of depression, he says. Majority of the time, I was focused on pursuing one of my options. By the fifth day, he realized his only chance for survival was to exercise his last option, to cut off his arm. Though his pocket knife was far too dull to cut through bone, he levered his body against the boulder to an angle that made it possible for him to snap his forearm bones above the wrist. Then he applied a tourniquet and amputated his arm. It took about an hour. Aaron then walked 6 miles before he was spotted by hikers and rescued. Not a religious person, he said his strength to endure the pain came from a higher power. He said there was a greater presence than just me in that canyon. In our society, where life has gotten pretty comfortable and the will to live is pretty submerged, it is perfectly possible now to cruise through life without ever having to fight for survival. Most of us will never be seriously threatened by hunger or exposure or attack. But each of us is faced with stresses and strains, sometimes on a regular basis and often on an intense basis, that wear away at our physical, mental, and spiritual health. Excuse me, I have a drink here somewhere. Without ever having to fight for survival, most of us will never be seriously threatened by hunger, exposure, or attack. Oh, I already said that. I'm sorry. But each of us is faced with stresses and strains, sometimes on a regular basis and sometimes on an intense basis that wear away at our physical and spiritual health. Disease and injury are common destroyers of well-being. Anxiety about illnesses, relationships, finances are a common currency in our lives. Problems with destructive and addictive behaviors, our own or those we love, they beat us down and they wear us out. The 2 survival stories I just shared with you are just a sample of the many books and stories I have read about seemingly hopeless contests between humans and hostile surroundings in which the human prevailed. I read these books and stories not for adventure, but because I am intrigued by the question, why do some people survive where so many others perish? I find myself in this current pandemic asking the same question. I find evidence that the answer has something to do with both will and grace. Firsthand, I have witnessed the powerful effects of both will and grace, or the lack of them, in hospitals and nursing homes, especially where life and death struggles are just as real. I have excavated stories of extreme hardship for lessons about how to cope with our common day-to-day tests of stress and survival. So at the heart of my message is a quest for the answer to that question. Why do some people survive and so many others are destroyed? In all the stories of which I am aware, I have noted the presence of three consistent factors, and these three have made a difference in surviving or not. Knowledge, and will, and grace. About the first factor, knowledge, the survivors' tools were in their brains. They stayed cool, they used their heads, they made rational decisions based on what they had learned in other environments. They willed themselves to be cool, to survive. Survivors are people who, when confronted with obstacles, choose not to see stumbling blocks, but to look for stepping stones. We spend most of our lives on the safe side of obstacles, even as we admire those who surmount them. We take the easy way out, arguing with great validity that it's just the better part of wisdom to do the practical thing. Nearly all survivors of horrendous physical ordeals have some combination of this knowledge, but it seems to me that none of them would have lived through their ordeals if they didn't also have at least some of the third factor, grace. And here we confront a mystery. The true nature of mystery is inherent in the concept of grace. Is it an electrical, biochemical resource hidden deep within our brains? Or is it a force that comes from some higher power? It is so mysterious, I cannot attempt to explain it. So I read these books and stories, and I look for clues. The most help came from a medical doctor called Ken Kamler. His book, he's written several of them, relate his many years of being a doctor on extreme expeditions. He says on his high altitude treks, he in fact had to perform surgery on Mount Everest, in deep jungle explorations, and in far-ranging desert caravans all over the world. The practicing medicine sometimes means witnessing and working alongside phenomena he could never possibly understand. Dr. Kamler said that he has acquired equal respect for both modern drugs and herbal cures, for satellites, signals, and for ancient chants, for both science and spirituality. And he believes absolutely that grace has brought a good many people to safety when competence ran out. This is true not only of people who survive extreme physical trauma, but also of people who survive cancer, childhood abuse, stress, trauma, both physical and psychological. In every case, those factors of knowledge and grace both play a role, but it seems to me that more often than not, The survivors are not the most physically fit, but the most spiritually fit. The true nature of surviving trauma remains mysterious. But in our culture, that's always telling us how weak we are, how vulnerable to sickness and death, how susceptible to all manner of physical and psychological damage, maybe we should try to remember to live by what we trust and not what we fear. I wish you all good health, good tidings in this difficult time. Peace be with you.